She was in labor, alone, sitting on a plastic chair in a hospital corridor, timing her contractions on her phone while her husband told her he was stuck in traffic. He was not in traffic. He was pulling up to the front entrance of the same hospital, opening the car door for another woman, a woman whose headache apparently required a $60,000 private suite, and a man who had stopped answering his pregnant wife's calls at 7 o'clock. And then he walked into her ward, saw her sitting there in labor alone, and instead of guilt, instead of shame, instead of the bare minimum of human decency, he looked at her and said 5 words that changed everything. Cassandra needs to lie down. He kicked his pregnant wife off her hospital bed to seat his mistress first, while nurses stood frozen, while his own mother watched from the corner and laughed at her contractions. But here's what none of them knew. Not the husband, not the mistress, not the mother who laughed. The woman they just humiliated, the woman sitting in that plastic chair, counting her breaths, saying nothing. She had purchased that entire hospital 14 months ago. She was a secret trillionaire, and she was about to make one phone call that would dismantle everything they thought they knew about power, about loyalty, and about the woman they had just made the worst mistake of their lives underestimating. What she did next left him so devastated he could not speak, and what was uncovered about his mistress destroyed every lie he had ever built his life around. This story will teach you one powerful truth. Never mistake silence for weakness, never confuse patience for ignorance, and never treat someone's most vulnerable moment as your opportunity, because you do not know who they are, and by the time you find out, it will be the most expensive discovery of your life. If that lesson resonates with you, drop the word dignity in the comments right now. Hit that like button so this story reaches someone who needs to hear it tonight. Share it with someone who has ever been underestimated. And subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that reminds you of your worth. Stay until the very last word, because that is where the most powerful moment lives. Dear viewers, if you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or humiliated by someone who thought they knew your worth, this story is for you. Today you will discover why the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one to cross, why betrayal always finds its way back to the betrayer, and why dignity held in silence is the most powerful response to cruelty. Watch every scene carefully, because every twist carries a life lesson. Drop in the comments what you learned and what you would have done in her shoes. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this. No one in that luxury hospital knew, not the head surgeon, not the admissions director, not the security team stationed at the lobby entrance, that the woman sitting alone in the corridor, counting contractions on her phone, pressing her back against a cold plastic chair, was the one who had purchased this entire building. She was a secret trillionaire, and she was unaware, in the truest sense of that word, of just how precisely her secret was about to become the most devastating weapon in the room. Not because she planned it that way, but because the universe had a perfect, terrible, surgical sense of timing. She had just bought this luxury hospital, acquired it as part of a larger portfolio, restructuring managed entirely by her private legal team 387 days ago. She had never visited it, had never walked its floors, had no idea that this would be the hospital where her child decided to arrive, had no idea that it would also be the hospital to which her husband, the man lying beside her every night for 5 years, would bring his mistress for a headache on the same night. His mistress had a headache. And he had brought her to the finest, most expensive luxury hospital in the city, the same building, the same floor, as if the universe had arranged every coordinate of this collision with deliberate, merciless precision. What happens when the most powerful woman in the room has been sitting in the corridor in silence the whole time? What did she do that left him so devastated he could not speak? And when the truth of who she really was finally hit him, was there anything left to save? Dear viewers, everything you just heard is only the beginning. The real story, the betrayal that runs deeper than one night, the secret that is bigger than one hospital, and the moment that finally breaks the man who thought he was untouchable is still ahead. This story will not just entertain you, it will show you what real strength looks like when it has been pushed to its absolute limit. Stay until the very last word, because that is where the most powerful lesson lives. Drop in the comments what you are thinking right now, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. The contractions had been coming every 6 minutes for the past 2 hours, but Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield had stopped timing them with panic and started timing them with the quiet, methodical precision of a woman who had learned very early in life that falling apart was a luxury she could rarely afford. She sat in the corridor of Meridian Grace Hospital, the finest medical facility in the city. 42 floors of polished marble, soft lighting, and the kind of hushed efficiency that only existed where serious money had been spent. And she pressed her back against the plastic chair with the careful stillness of someone trying not to draw attention to her own suffering. Her go-bag sat between her feet. She had packed it herself 3 weeks ago, folding each item with the tender anticipation of a woman who had waited 5 years for this moment. A white onesie with a small bear embroidered on the pocket, a card her mother had written before she passed, a single photograph of her grandmother, Margaret Ashworth, the woman who had looked at a young Eleanor across a mahogany desk 18 months ago and said, "Everything I built for someone worthy of carrying it. That is you." Eleanor had not fully understood what that meant until the attorneys called 6 weeks later. But tonight, sitting in this corridor, she was not thinking about attorneys or blind trusts or the staggering sum of zeros that lived quietly behind her name and documents she rarely opened. She was thinking about the fact that her husband, Dalton, had not answered her third call. She was thinking about the way the nurse at the admissions desk had processed her with the detached efficiency of someone checking in a parcel. She was thinking about how the overhead lights in this corridor were slightly too bright and slightly too cold, and how she wished more than anything that there was one person sitting beside her. There was not. She had called Dalton at 6:47 in the evening when the contractions were still 12 minutes apart, and she had enough composure to keep her voice steady. He had answered on the 4th ring, his voice carrying that particular texture of distraction that she had learned to recognize over the past 8 months, the texture of a man whose attention was divided between the person on the phone and something or someone in the room with him. "I am on my way," he had said. "Traffic is bad. Just get checked in. I will be there." She had believed him because 5 years of marriage had not yet fully extinguished the instinct to believe him, and because the alternative, the thing she had been quietly suspecting for 8 months but had never allowed herself to name out loud, was a weight she was not ready to carry on top of everything else. Here's something worth remembering, dear viewers. How someone treats you when they think you have nothing to offer tells you everything about who they really are. Pay attention to that. It will save you years. But Dalton was not in traffic. At the precise moment Eleanor was being directed to the shared ward on the 3rd floor, Dalton Whitfield was pulling his silver car to a smooth stop at the main entrance of Meridian Grace Hospital, stepping out with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own authority in any room he entered, and opening the passenger door for a woman named Cassandra Reeves. Cassandra had a headache. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to her right temple as she stepped out of the car, her coat perfectly tailored, her boots clicking against the hospital entrance tiles with the deliberate rhythm of a woman who understood that every entrance was a performance. She was not in distress. She was in costume. But Dalton guided her through those doors with both hands, one at her back, one briefly touching her arm, with more visible tenderness than he had shown his laboring wife in the last 3 months combined. The admissions nurse processed Cassandra Reeves with a private suite request and a credit card that Dalton placed on the counter without hesitation. It was the same counter where 40 minutes earlier, Eleanor had quietly asked if there were any private rooms available and been told, with a practiced smile, that the shared ward was the only option without prior reservation. Dalton had not made a prior reservation for his wife. He had, Eleanor would later discover, made one for Cassandra 2 days ago. The shared ward on the 3rd floor had 4 beds, separated by pale curtains. Eleanor had been placed in the bed nearest the window, the best position in the room, the nurse had said, with a kindness that felt genuine. She had settled into it carefully, arranging the thin blanket across her legs, and had just reached for her phone to try Dalton one more time when the curtain at the ward entrance shifted. And Dalton walked in. He was not alone. The contraction hit Eleanor at exactly that moment, a wave so powerful it compressed every coherent thought she had into a single white, hot point of physical focus. And when it released, and her vision cleared, and she could see again, she saw her husband standing at the entrance of her ward with his mistress on his arm. His mother, Vivian Whitfield, rose from the chair in the corner, where she had been sitting so silently that Eleanor had not even registered her presence. Vivian straightened her jacket, said nothing, but the look she exchanged with her son carried the entire conversation in less than 2 seconds. Dalton walked to Eleanor's bed. He did not ask how she was. He did not look at her with guilt or apology or the bare minimum of human acknowledgement that the situation demanded. He looked at her the way a man looks at an inconvenient obstacle, something to be moved efficiently and without sentiment. And he said, in a voice so low that only Eleanor and Vivian could hear it clearly, "Cassandra needs to lie down. Her head is killing her. You can sit in the chair." Eleanor stared at him. Another contraction was already building. She could feel it gathering at the base of her spine like a storm front, still 30 seconds away, but coming fast. And in the space between that gathering and that breaking, she looked at the man she had married, the man whose child she was hours away from delivering, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she had been wrong about him for a very long time. She did not move fast enough. Dalton reached past her, gripped the bed rail, and with one firm, decisive gesture, shifted the position of the bed away from her, angling it toward Cassandra, clearing the space, making the transfer of occupancy unmistakable and public. He had kicked his pregnant wife off the hospital bed to seat his mistress first, for a headache. The nurse at the station, 3 feet away, had gone completely still. Her name was Rachel Daniels, 35 years old, 12 years in obstetric nursing, and she stood behind that counter, watching what was unfolding in front of her with the particular frozen expression of a woman who was witnessing something she knew was wrong, but whose position in the room did not give her the authority to stop it. She picked up her coffee cup slowly and took one long, deliberate sip. It was the only thing she could do. The woman in the bed across the ward had stopped reading her magazine. The overhead lights seemed somehow brighter, somehow more exposing, as though the room itself wanted every detail of this moment preserved and visible. And Vivian Whitfield, watching her daughter-in-law grip the window ledge as the contraction finally arrived in full force, watching her bend forward, watching the involuntary sound escape her that no woman should ever have to make alone, covered her mouth, not in horror, in laughter. It was a small sound, deliberate. The particular kind of cruelty that is worse than shouting because it arrives dressed as amusement, and it landed on Eleanor like something physical, like something that left a mark. When someone shows you who they are in a crisis, dear viewers, when they laugh at your pain, dismiss your suffering, or treat your vulnerability as entertainment, believe them the first time, not the second, not the third, the first. Vivian Whitfield had spent 4 years making her feelings about Eleanor perfectly clear through the elegant, deniable cruelty that certain kinds of women perfect over decades of practice. The Christmas dinner, where she had looked at the modest bracelet Dalton had given Eleanor, and said with a smile as thin as paper, "How sweet, he always did have simple taste in accessories." The family photographs that Vivian arranged and rearranged on the mantelpiece, Eleanor always at the edge, always slightly cropped, always positioned, as though she had wandered into the frame by accident. The way Vivian spoke about Cassandra Reeves at family gatherings, before Eleanor had even confirmed the woman existed. A remarkable woman, really, the kind who understands what a man like Dalton actually needs, with the particular enthusiasm of a mother who had already chosen her son's next wife and was simply waiting for the current one to receive the memo. Eleanor had never responded to any of it, not because she was weak, but because she had inherited, along with her grandmother's fortune, her grandmother's most fundamental philosophy, that the most powerful response to a person who underestimates you is to let them continue doing so, right up until the moment it is no longer useful. That moment, Eleanor had decided 4 seconds after Vivian laughed at her contractions had arrived. Eleanor straightened slowly. The contraction ebbed. She released the window ledge. She turned and looked at Vivian, really looked at her, with eyes that had just finished grieving something and were now completely, utterly clear. And she reached into her go-bag. She pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a contact that had no name, only a symbol. A small crown. She pressed call. The phone rang twice, just twice. And then a voice answered that was not the voice of a receptionist, not the voice of an assistant, not the voice of anyone who needed to be told twice what to do. It was the voice of a man named Gerald Holt, 63 years old, 22 years in private wealth management, a man who had navigated the financial architecture of 3 generations of the Ashworth fortune with the quiet precision of a surgeon who never once left a scar where it was not intended. Eleanor spoke 4 words. "Gerald, I am here." There was a pause. Not the pause of confusion, but the pause of a man rapidly recalibrating every variable in a situation he had not anticipated, but was entirely equipped to handle. Then Gerald said, in the measured tone of someone who had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this kind of moment, "I understand. Give me 8 minutes." In the car beside Gerald, his nephew, Tommy Holt, 28 years old and 6 months into his junior associate position at the foundation, looked up from his phone. Gerald had already hung up and was reaching for his coat. "Change of plans," Gerald said. "We are going to Meridian Grace." Tommy blinked. "At 10 at night? What is at Meridian Grace?" Gerald adjusted his glasses, opened the car door, and said one word. "Everything." Eleanor ended the call. She slipped the phone back into her go-bag. She lowered herself into the chair beside the window, the chair her husband had relegated her to so that his mistress could occupy her bed, and she folded her hands in her lap with the stillness of a woman who had just set something irreversible into motion and was now simply waiting for it to arrive. Dalton was not watching her. He was adjusting the pillow behind Cassandra's head, speaking to her in a low, solicitous murmur, his hand resting on the bed rail with the proprietary ease of a man who had entirely forgotten, or entirely stopped caring, that his wife was 4 feet away and in active labor. Vivian had resettled into her corner chair. She had produced a compact mirror from her handbag and was touching up her lipstick with the serene concentration of a woman attending a social event rather than a maternity ward. She caught Eleanor's reflection in the compact mirror once, just once, and the look she offered was not malice exactly. It was something colder than malice. It was dismissal. 8 minutes. Eleanor breathed through another contraction alone, one hand pressed flat against the window glass, her eyes focused on the city lights below, and she waited. The shift in the atmosphere began exactly 7 minutes and 40 seconds after Eleanor's call. It was subtle at first, the particular change in air pressure that happens when people who are accustomed to authority enter a space, and the people already in that space unconsciously rearrange themselves around the new hierarchy. Eleanor heard it before she saw it, the different quality of footsteps in the corridor, the swift, low exchange of voices that carried the cadence of instruction rather than conversation, the sound of a door opening with more purpose than doors in hospital corridors usually opened. And then Gerald Holt walked into the ward. He was not alone. He was flanked by 2 people, a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio, and a man in a dark blazer whose hospital identification badge was different from every other badge Eleanor had seen that evening. Different color, different weight, the kind of badge that opened doors that other badges did not. Gerald was 63 years old and looked every year of it. Silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that inspired immediate, involuntary trust. But he moved through that ward with the authority of a man who had just remembered, or perhaps simply announced, that he owned the building, which technically his client did. He crossed the ward in 12 steps. He stopped in front of Eleanor. He looked at her, at the chair she was sitting in, at the hospital bed 4 feet away where another woman was reclining with theatrical discomfort, at the man standing beside that bed, who had just turned around with the startled expression of someone who had not expected company. And Gerald's face communicated, in the span of a single second, everything that needed to be communicated before a single word was spoken. Then he turned to the nurse, the same nurse who had stood frozen at the station when Dalton removed Eleanor from her bed, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and absolutely final, "Please prepare the executive suite on the 38th floor for Mrs. Whitfield immediately. Full obstetric team. Dr. Anita Carver is to lead. She is already on her way up." Nurse Rachel Daniels did not hesitate. She did not ask for clarification. She did not look at Dalton for confirmation. She nodded once and left the ward at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything just short of it. Dalton had turned fully around now. His hand had dropped from the bedrail. His expression had moved through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, irritation, the particular indignation of a man whose authority has been casually overridden in a space he considered his. And he settled on the version of himself that had always worked in boardrooms, in family dinners, in every situation where he needed to reestablish dominance quickly. He drew himself up to his full height. "Excuse me," he said, directing the words at Gerald with the clipped precision of a man who expected immediate deference. "Who exactly are you, and why are you issuing instructions to staff in my wife's ward?" Gerald looked at Dalton Whitfield with the patient, faintly sorrowful expression of a man watching someone walk confidently toward a cliff he could not yet see. "My name is Gerald Holt," he said. "I am the executive trustee and legal representative of the Ashworth Whitfield Private Foundation, which, as of 14 months ago, holds full controlling interest in Meridian Grace Hospital and its parent company, Meridian Health Group." He paused. "Let that land, Miss Eleanor Whitfield," he continued, "is the sole beneficiary and principal owner of that foundation." The ward was absolutely silent. Tommy Holt, standing at the ward entrance, holding Gerald's briefcase, watched this unfold with his mouth slightly open. He looked at Nurse Rachel, who had paused at the station on her way out. She picked up her coffee cup, took another sip, slow, deliberate, the sip of a woman who had just witnessed the most satisfying reversal of her entire nursing career and was savoring every second of it. Dalton's expression did not collapse immediately. It went through a strange, slow process, like a building whose load-bearing walls have been removed, but whose facade is still standing through sheer architectural memory, holding its shape for a few seconds longer than physics should allow before the inevitable. Vivian had lowered her compact mirror. Cassandra had stopped performing her headache, and Eleanor, from her chair beside the window, looked at her husband for a long, steady moment, looked at the man who had moved her from her bed, who had brought another woman to her hospital, who had stood beside her for 5 years and never once thought to ask what she was carrying beneath her silence. And she said, quietly and without heat, "Gerald, please have Miss Reeves discharged from the premises." She came in for a headache. She stood, smoothed her maternity dress, picked up her go bag. "Dalton," she said, as she moved toward the door with Gerald and his team forming a quiet perimeter around her, "your mother laughed at my contractions. She did not say it with anger. She said it the way a person records a fact, clearly, permanently, for the benefit of anyone listening. Remember that," she said, "because I will." And she walked out of that ward, out of that bed, out of that corner, out of the version of herself that had been sitting quietly in chairs that were beneath her for 5 years. And she did not look back once. The elevator doors opened on the 38th floor, and Eleanor stepped into a world that was so different from the corridor she had just left that it felt, for a moment, like stepping between two entirely separate realities, separated not by floors, but by the full staggering distance between who she had been pretending to be and who she actually was. The executive suite level of Meridian Grace Hospital had been designed by the same architectural firm that had built 3 of the most celebrated private medical facilities in Europe. The floors were a warm Italian marble. The lighting was amber and deliberate, and the air carried the faint, clean scent of eucalyptus that came from a ventilation system that had cost more to install than most people earned in a decade. There were fresh flowers on the console table beside the elevator. White peonies in a crystal vase replaced every morning, regardless of whether anyone was present to see them. Eleanor had paid for those flowers, technically, without ever knowing they existed. Dr. Anita Carver was already waiting at the suite entrance, 51 years old, the most decorated obstetric specialist in the city, a woman whose reputation had been built over 26 years of delivering children into the world with the kind of focused, unhurried excellence that money could access but could not manufacture. She had received Gerald's call 11 minutes ago. She had been in the hospital already, finishing rounds on the floor below, and she had made her way up with the composed urgency of a professional who understood that some situations simply required her to be present. She took one look at Eleanor, at the tightness around her eyes, the careful way she was holding her body. the go bag hanging from her shoulder, like a quiet testament to how alone she had been all evening, and she said nothing about the circumstances that had brought her here. She simply placed one hand briefly on Eleanor's arm and said, "You are in the right place now. Everything from here is taken care of." It was 11 words, but they were the first 11 words anyone had spoken to Eleanor that entire evening that had been directed entirely at her well-being, without agenda, without performance, and without the complicated weight of someone else's priorities pressing beneath them. And Eleanor felt them land somewhere deep and necessary. She nodded once, allowed herself to be guided inside. The suite was extraordinary. A full private room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A medical setup that was indistinguishable from a five-star hotel room until you looked closely and saw the quiet, precise machinery of world-class obstetric care arranged with elegant discretion around the perimeter. There was a chair, a real chair, wide and cushioned, positioned beside the bed. Not a plastic corridor chair. Not a chair someone had relegated her to so another woman could take her place. A chair that was there because someone had anticipated that she might want to sit beside her own child after the birth. Eleanor set her go bag on the bedside table. She took out the white onesie with the small bear on the pocket. She set it where she could see it. Then she took out her grandmother's photograph, Margaret Ashworth, the woman who had built an empire quietly, who had lived simply despite extraordinary wealth, who had told Eleanor once, across a mahogany desk, with the particular gravity of a woman who knew she was running out of time to say the things that mattered, "The money is the least of what I am leaving you. What I am leaving you is the proof that a woman who is underestimated has a weapon that no one can disarm, because no one thinks to look for it." Eleanor had not understood it then. She understood it now, completely, in the way that certain truths only become clear once you have lived through the exact experience they were designed to prepare you for. 3 floors below, the third floor shared ward had become a very different kind of theater. Dalton Whitfield had not moved for 40 seconds after Eleanor walked out. He had stood in the center of that ward beside the bed he had cleared for his mistress, in front of the nurse station where Rachel Daniels was very carefully not looking at him, under the fluorescent lights that had suddenly lost all their flattering quality. His wife owned this hospital, not partially, not as a minor investor. Fully, completely, the building he was standing in, the floor beneath his feet, the bed he had just commandeered for another woman. All of it belonged to Eleanor, had belonged to Eleanor for 14 months, while he was conducting his affair with the particular arrogance of a man who believed his wife was too simple, too grateful, too dependent to ever surprise him. The realization did not arrive gently. It arrived the way structural failures arrive, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a series of small sequential surrenders, each one revealing the next, until the full weight of what had been holding everything up was suddenly, catastrophically visible in its absence. He turned to Vivian. His mother was sitting very still. The compact mirror had been returned to her handbag. Her lipstick was perfect. But her face? The face that had watched Eleanor's contractions with amusement. The face that had spent 4 years arranging family photographs, with Eleanor at the edges, had undergone a transformation that Dalton had never seen in 51 years of knowing her. Vivian Whitfield, who had never in her adult life been in a room where she was not the most strategically positioned person present, looked for the first time like someone who had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Did you know?" Dalton said. It was not a question delivered with anger. It was delivered with the hollow, weightless quality of a man standing in the rubble of something he had built with his own hands. Vivian said nothing. Cassandra, who had been sitting up in the bed with the progressive discomfort of a woman whose performance had lost its audience, swung her legs over the side and reached for her coat. Her headache had apparently resolved. "I think I should go," she said. "Yes," said Rachel from the station, without looking up from her screen. "You should." On the 38th floor, Eleanor breathed through her next contraction with Dr. Carver beside her. Not alone. Not in a corridor. Not in a chair that someone had assigned to her as a consolation. And when it passed, she looked out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows and thought about her grandmother. She thought about the woman who had built everything quietly, who had never once raised her voice to announce her power, because she had understood that the most unassailable power was the kind that announced itself only when it needed to. Gerald knocked softly and entered. He was carrying a single document in a leather folder, the kind of folder that contained things that could not be undone once signed. He set it on the table, beside Eleanor's go-bag. "The Foundation's legal team is ready," Gerald said quietly. "Whenever you are." Eleanor looked at the document. It was the restructuring directive she had asked Gerald to prepare. A reallocation of a significant portion of the Ashworth-Whitfield Foundation's annual endowment toward maternal health care funding. Specifically, targeting hospitals in underserved communities where women in labor sat alone in corridors on plastic chairs because no one had thought to provide better. It was not a revenge decision. It was a clarity decision, the kind that only becomes possible once you have lived through the exact thing you are trying to prevent for someone else. She signed it. Her full name. Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield, with the calm, unhurried certainty of a woman who was not ending something. She was beginning it. When you leave a situation that was destroying you, dear viewers, a bad relationship, a toxic job, a friendship that only takes, the hardest part is not the leaving. It is resisting the urge to go back when the person who hurt you suddenly realizes what they have lost. Protect your peace. It is the most valuable thing you own. For a moment, everything was quiet. Everything was right. Eleanor was safe. Her child was coming. The nightmare of the third floor was behind her. But 40 minutes into that peace, Gerald's phone rang, and the voice on the other end delivered news that shattered the calm like a stone through glass. Vivian Whitfield had not sat still. While Dalton was paralyzed on the third floor, Vivian had made a call, not to a family member, to Harrison Crane, the Whitfield family's corporate attorney. A shark in a tailored suit who had been on retainer for 20 years and who understood, with the instincts of a predator, that the best time to attack was when your opponent believed the fight was over. Within 40 minutes of Eleanor's departure from the third floor, Crane had arrived at the hospital with an emergency filing, a prenatal custody petition claiming Eleanor was, and these were the exact words on the document, emotionally unstable and financially secretive. Grounds, he argued, for immediate supervised custody evaluation the moment the child was born. The filing included a sworn statement from Vivian alleging that Eleanor had concealed significant financial assets from her spouse, demonstrating a pattern of deception incompatible with the child's best interest. Gerald delivered the news to Eleanor between contractions. She was mid-breath, mid-focus, mid the most important physical event of her entire life, and she was informed that a legal team was attempting to station a court-appointed observer in her delivery room. The peace was shattered. The false victory collapsed. Narcissists do not just lose, dear viewers. They escalate. When you finally stand up to someone who has controlled you, expect them, or the people around them, to retaliate with everything they have. Prepare for it. Have your own team. Document everything. But Gerald Holt had not spent 22 years managing the Ashworth fortune by being surprised. He had spent 22 years anticipating every possible angle of attack and building defenses that did not look like defenses until the moment they were needed. Within 90 minutes, Gerald had dismantled Crane's filing with surgical precision. He produced documentation showing that Eleanor's assets were held in a premarital blind trust, legally separate from the marriage. There was no obligation to disclose. The deception claim was baseless. Furthermore, Gerald filed a counter motion. Evidence of Dalton's extramarital affair, including the private suite reservation made in Cassandra's name 2 days prior, credit card records, and time-stamped hospital security footage of Dalton removing his laboring wife from her hospital bed to seat his mistress. The emergency judge rejected Crane's petition within 90 minutes of its filing. It was not close. Tommy Holt, who had been running documents between floors for the past hour and a half, arrived on the 38th floor breathless. His tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, looking less like a junior associate and more like a man who had just survived a natural disaster. He set the final document on Gerald's table, exhaled, and said, "Is it always like this?" Gerald, without looking up, said, "This is a quiet night." Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield's daughter arrived at 11:47 in the evening. She came into the world on the 38th floor of a hospital her mother owned, delivered by the finest obstetrics specialist in the city, in a room filled with the kind of quiet, focused care that asked nothing in return and offered everything it had. She arrived without fanfare, without announcement, without the complicated theater of people who had not earned the right to be present, pretending that they had. And when Dr. Carver placed her in Eleanor's arms for the first time, still wrapped in the soft warmth of her first minutes of existence, Eleanor looked down at her daughter's face and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Complete. Not the fragile, conditional completeness of a woman who has arranged her wholeness around another person's presence, but the deep structural completeness of someone who has returned after a long and disorienting journey to the truth of who they are. She held her daughter against her chest and felt the weight of her, the perfect, specific, irreplaceable weight of this particular child, this particular moment, and she made a promise that she did not speak aloud because it did not need to be spoken. It only needed to be meant. You will never sit in a chair that is beneath you. Not once. Not ever. Not while I am alive. Gerald returned to the suite at midnight with a cup of tea he had sourced from the executive kitchen and the news that the Foundation's legal team had already begun preparing the secondary documentation Eleanor had requested. Eleanor was nursing her daughter when he entered. She looked up. Gerald set the tea on the table beside her with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 22 years anticipating needs before they were expressed. "He is downstairs," Gerald said quietly. "He has been there for some time." Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the small, perfect face, at the bear on the white onesie. "Gerald," she said, "what did my grandmother do when my grandfather underestimated her?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. He had known Margaret Ashworth for 19 years before her death, and the answer to this question was not simple, but it was clear, and it was the kind of answer that deserved to be given without embellishment. "She built something so significant," Gerald said, "that the underestimation became the most expensive mistake he ever made, not because she wanted to punish him, but because she refused to let it define the ceiling of what she was capable of." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Tell him he can come up, but tell him to come alone. Not his mother, not anyone else, just him." Dalton stepped out of the elevator onto the 38th floor at 12:17 in the morning, and the first thing he registered was the difference. The marble, the peonies, the amber light, the air that carried the scent of eucalyptus, and the contrast with where he had spent the last 2 hours was so complete and so deliberate that it felt like an argument made entirely through architecture. Eleanor was sitting in the wide cushioned chair when he entered, their daughter asleep against her chest. The city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a statement about scale and perspective. She did not look up immediately when he came in. She finished what she was doing, adjusting the edge of the white onesie very carefully with the focused tenderness of a woman for whom this moment was the only thing in the room that mattered. And then she looked at him. Dalton Whitfield had walked into a great many rooms in his life with confidence. He had built a career on the ability to enter spaces and immediately recalibrate them around his own authority. But standing in the entrance of that suite, looking at his wife in that chair with their daughter asleep on her chest, he had nothing. No recalibration was possible. No authority existed to assert. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Eleanor. Her name is Margaret, Eleanor said quietly. After my grandmother. Something in his face broke open then, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a man performing remorse, but with the quiet, structural surrender of someone who has finally, irreversibly understood the full weight of what they have done and found it unbearable. I did not know, he said. I know you did not, Eleanor said. That was never the point. She looked at him steadily, with eyes that had finished grieving, that had moved through every stage of what this night had asked of them and come out the other side into something cleaner and more honest than anything she had felt in years. The point, she said, was that it should not have mattered. Who I am should not have been the reason you treated me with dignity. You should have treated me with dignity because I was your wife, because I was carrying your child, because I was a person in the worst hours of her night, and you were the one person I had the right to expect beside me. He had no answer for this. There was no answer for it. It was simply, completely, devastatingly true. You can see her, Eleanor said softly. She deserves to know her father. But Dalton, she also deserves to know what it looks like when a person knows their worth. So do I. Dalton looked at Margaret, at the small sleeping face, and for one moment the room held something that almost resembled peace. Good night, Eleanor said, and Dalton Whitfield walked back to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and stood in the descending silence with what he believed was the full understanding of what he had lost. He was wrong. He did not yet know the half of it. At 2:14 in the morning, Cassandra Reeves sat in the back of a ride-share car 6 blocks from Meridian Grace Hospital, and she made a phone call that would detonate what remained of the evening's fragile aftermath into something far larger and far more destructive than anything that had happened inside that building. The call was to a man named Derek Voss, 41 years old, a gossip journalist who operated in the gray space between tabloid reporting and social media manipulation. The kind of person who understood that in the modern attention economy, the first version of a story that reaches the public becomes the truth, regardless of whether it is true. Derek, Cassandra said, I have a story, and it is worth a lot more than what you usually pay. By 3:30 in the morning, the story was written. By 4:15, it was published on 3 separate platforms. By 5, it was trending. The headline read, Secret Trillionaire Exposed. Hospital Heiress Humiliates Husband, Girlfriend in Public Power Play. The framing was devastating. Eleanor was painted not as the victim, not as a woman in labor, who had been removed from her own hospital bed by her cheating husband, but as a vengeful billionaire who had orchestrated the entire evening to publicly destroy her husband's mistress. Cassandra was positioned as the sympathetic figure, just a woman with a headache who was thrown out of a hospital by a jealous wife who happened to own the building. The article quoted unnamed sources. It referenced Cassandra's headache as a legitimate medical concern that was callously dismissed. It described Gerald Holt's arrival as an intimidation tactic designed to humiliate civilians in a medical setting. It mentioned nothing about the bed, nothing about the contractions, nothing about the laughter. By 6 in the morning, Eleanor's name, her face pulled from old social media accounts, her grandmother's foundation, the hospital acquisition, all of it was public. The privacy Eleanor Vaux had protected for years, the anonymity that had been her grandmother's most deliberate gift, was gone in one headline. Gerald woke Eleanor at 6:20 with the news. She was in the 38th floor suite, Margaret sleeping in the bassinet beside her, the city beginning to lighten through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked at the phone screen Gerald held out to her. She read the headline. She read the first 3 paragraphs. And for the first time all night, a different kind of pain crossed her face. Not the pain of contractions, not the pain of betrayal, the pain of exposure, the particular violation of having your story told by someone who is never entitled to tell it, told wrong, told in a way designed to make you the villain of your own worst night. In the age of social media, dear viewers, your reputation can be rewritten by someone else in minutes. The only defense is the truth, documented, time-stamped, and ready before you need it. If you are in any situation where someone might twist the narrative, start keeping records now, not tomorrow. Now. Eleanor set the phone down. She looked at Margaret, she looked at the city, and then she looked at Gerald. "What do we have?" she asked. Gerald opened his leather portfolio. "Everything," he said. The hospital security footage from every camera on the 3rd floor, time-stamped and unedited. The admissions records showing Cassandra's suite was reserved 2 days in advance, while no reservation was made for Eleanor. The credit card records, the nurse station logs, the call records from Dalton's phone showing his location at the time he told Eleanor he was in traffic. And, he added, placing one final document on the table, the visitor log showing that Vivian Whitfield arrived at the hospital 45 minutes before Eleanor did and was already seated in the 3rd floor ward when Eleanor was admitted. She was waiting. Eleanor looked at that last piece of information for a long time. She was waiting, Eleanor repeated. Gerald nodded. She knew you were coming. She knew Dalton was bringing Miss Reeves. She positioned herself in advance. The cruelty was not spontaneous. It was choreographed. Eleanor closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were dry and clear and absolutely resolved. "What else?" she said. Gerald paused. "There is more," he said, "but you may want to hear it after you have rested." "I do not want to rest," Eleanor said. "I want to know everything." What Gerald told Eleanor over the next 40 minutes on the 38th floor of Meridian Grace Hospital, while Margaret slept and the city brightened and the tabloid stories spread like fire through dry grass, was not a single revelation. It was an archaeology, layer after layer of calculated betrayal, each one deeper than the last, each one revealing a structure beneath the surface that Eleanor had sensed for years but had never been able to fully see. Gerald began with Vivian. When the Foundation's security protocols flagged the custody petition filed by Harrison Crane, Gerald had activated a standard review of all communications between the Whitfield family and external parties over the previous 18 months. It was a precaution he had built into the Foundation's operating framework years ago, at Margaret Ashworth's explicit instruction in case the family ever attempted to access the trust through legal pressure. What the review uncovered was not a reaction to tonight's events. It was a campaign. Vivian Whitfield had been in contact with a man named Victor Hale for over a year. Victor Hale was 68 years old, former CEO of Hale Meridian Industries, and 15 years ago, he had mounted a hostile takeover bid against the Ashworth Empire. A bid that Margaret Ashworth had defeated so thoroughly and so publicly that Victor Hale had spent the subsequent decade and a half nursing a grudge that had calcified into something patient and deliberate and very, very dangerous. Vivian's communications with Victor, recovered through the Foundation's encrypted monitoring system, revealed a coordination that went far beyond coincidence. Victor had been providing Vivian with strategic advice on how to position Dalton for a divorce that would give him maximum claim to any assets Eleanor might be concealing. Vivian had been feeding Victor information about Eleanor's behavior, her habits, her emotional state, building a dossier designed to support exactly the kind of instability claim that Harrison Crane had filed tonight. The affair with Cassandra was not spontaneous, Gerald said. It was introduced. Eleanor looked at him. Introduced, she repeated. Gerald placed a document on the table. Cassandra Reeves, he said. Born Cassandra Hale Reeves, Victor Hale's stepdaughter. The room was very quiet. Cassandra was placed in Dalton's social circle 14 months ago through a real estate networking event that Victor Hale's company sponsored. The introduction was deliberate. The relationship was cultivated with a specific, strategic objective: to destabilize your marriage from within, to create grounds for divorce that would give the Whitfield family leverage, and to position Dalton as the injured party when the full scope of your inheritance eventually became public. Eleanor sat very still. She looked at the photograph of her grandmother on the bedside table, at the face of the woman who had built everything, who had defeated Victor Hale 15 years ago, who had told Eleanor, across a mahogany desk, that the money was the least of what she was leaving her. Dalton was not the architect, Eleanor said quietly. He was the pawn. Gerald nodded. He was the pawn. Trust your instincts, dear viewers. If someone's behavior toward you feels coordinated, if every slight, every exclusion, every innocent comment seems to build toward the same conclusion, it might not be paranoia. It might be a pattern, and patterns have architects. But the conspiracy was not finished unraveling, because Victor Hale, emboldened by the tabloid story that had just handed him exactly the kind of public chaos he needed as cover, moved faster than anyone anticipated. At 8:30 in the morning, less than 6 hours after Cassandra's call to Derek Voss, Victor Hale's legal team filed a formal challenge to the Ashworth Foundation Trust. The argument was technical, aggressive, and designed to create maximum disruption. The trust, they claimed, had been improperly structured. Margaret Ashworth, they alleged, had not been of sound mind when she designated Eleanor as sole heir. The entire inheritance, they argued, was legally vulnerable. And as part of the filing, Victor's team supported a renewed custody petition, this time with more sophisticated legal backing. The argument was simple and devastating. If the trust was invalidated, Eleanor's assets became marital property, and the concealment of marital property became grounds for a custody evaluation. Eleanor faced losing everything: her grandmother's legacy, her daughter, her freedom, all because she had loved a man who never deserved it, and because that man's family had been in partnership with her grandmother's oldest enemy without her ever knowing. This was the lowest point. Eleanor sat in the 38th floor suite, Margaret sleeping in the bassinet, city fully lit now, through the windows, and for the first time all night. She was not composed. She was afraid. She picked up her grandmother's photograph. She looked at it for a long time, and she remembered what Gerald had told her hours ago. She built something so significant that the underestimation became the most expensive mistake he ever made. Eleanor set the photograph down. She looked at Gerald. "I need Tommy," she said, "and I need every document the Foundation has on Victor Hale, going back 15 years. Gerald allowed himself, for the first time that evening, a very small smile. "Already prepared," he said. Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield did not play defense. She played architecture. And what she built in the next 72 hours from a hospital suite on the 38th floor with a newborn daughter beside her and a legal team that answered to no one but her was not a counterattack. It was a cathedral of consequence. Every stone placed with precision, every angle calculated, every move designed not to destroy her enemies, but to make the truth so visible, so comprehensive, and so irrefutable that the destruction happened on its own. Move 1. The truth. Eleanor released a single public statement, not through a public relations firm, not through a media intermediary, through the Ashworth Whitfield Foundation's official channels. No spin, no narrative management, just facts. The hospital security footage from the 3rd floor, time-stamped and unedited, with all faces visible except the other patients in the ward. The admissions records showing the private suite reserved for Cassandra 2 days in advance. The credit card records, the call logs showing Dalton's location when he told Eleanor he was in traffic. The visitor log showing Vivian's premeditated positioning in the ward before Eleanor arrived. She let the evidence speak, and it spoke so loudly that every tabloid that had run Cassandra's version spent the next 24 hours scrambling to reframe their coverage. Derek Voss, the journalist who had published the original story, received a formal legal notice from the Foundation's communications team. Not a threat, a correction request, with documentation so thorough that his editor pulled the article within 6 hours of receiving it. Move 2. The counter-challenge. Gerald filed a formal response to Victor Hale's trust challenge, and the document he submitted to the court contained a single piece of evidence that ended the challenge before it could gain any traction. 15 years ago, when Victor Hale had attempted his hostile takeover of the Ashworth Empire, his own legal firm had conducted a comprehensive review of the Ashworth Trust structure as part of their due diligence. And that review, filed with the court as part of the takeover proceedings, had concluded in writing that the Ashworth Trust was properly structured, legally sound, and that Margaret Ashworth was fully competent in all matters related to its administration. Victor Hale's current claim that the trust was improperly structured directly contradicted his own firm's prior legal opinion. His firm had already validated the very trust he was now trying to invalidate. The judge did not need long to reach a conclusion. The challenge was dismissed with prejudice. Victor Hale's legal team was referred to the state bar for an ethics review. Move 3. The divorce. Eleanor filed for divorce on the morning of the 3rd day. The filing was clean, precise, and devastating. It included Dalton's intercepted communications with Victor Hale, proving that he had conspired with his wife's family's oldest business rival to undermine her inheritance. It included the evidence of the affair with Cassandra. It included the hospital footage. And it included one additional piece of information that Gerald had saved for this exact moment. Cassandra Reeves was not just Dalton's mistress. She was Victor Hale's stepdaughter. The entire relationship had been a strategic operation. Cassandra had been placed in Dalton's path by Victor as a part of a coordinated campaign to infiltrate the Ashworth family through the marriage. When this information became public, the reaction was seismic, not because of the money, not because of the hospital, but because the story had become something larger than a marriage ending. It had become a story about a woman who was underestimated by every person around her, who endured that underestimation with grace for years, and who, when the moment demanded it, revealed that the person they had dismissed was the most powerful one in the room. Tommy Holt, who had been running documents and coordinating communications for 72 hours straight and looked like a man who had aged 5 years and 3 days, sat down in Gerald's office after the divorce filing was submitted and said, "I need to sit down." Gerald, reviewing the final document, said without looking up, "You are sitting down." Tommy stared at the ceiling. "I need to sit down more." The fallout arrived with the swift, inevitable precision of gravity acting on something that had been suspended too long. Cassandra Reeves was exposed publicly. Her connection to Victor Hale became the centerpiece of every news cycle that had previously been running her version of the hospital story. Her real estate career, which had been built on connections and appearances, and the particular currency of being seen in the right rooms with the right people, collapsed in less than a week. Victor Hale had clients who could tolerate aggressive business tactics. They could not tolerate the public revelation that he had used his own stepdaughter as a strategic instrument in a personal vendetta. His board requested his resignation within 10 days. His 15-year grudge had cost him everything. Harrison Crane, the Whitfield family attorney who had filed the original custody petition at Vivian's direction, quietly withdrew from the case and from the Whitfield family's retainer entirely. He had been in practice long enough to recognize when a client had become a liability. And Vivian Whitfield, Vivian, who had spent 4 years engineering Eleanor's removal from the family, who had laughed at her daughter-in-law's contractions in a hospital ward, who had positioned herself as the architect of a campaign so calculated and so cruel that even her own children were horrified when the full scope of it became clear. Vivian was cut off from the Whitfield Family Trust by Dalton's own siblings, who issued a joint statement through their attorney that was only 3 sentences long, but communicated everything that needed to be communicated. Vivian Whitfield was not invited to meet her granddaughter. She would not be invited. And the family photographs on the mantelpiece, the ones she had spent years arranging and rearranging with Eleanor, always at the edges, were taken down entirely. 6 months later, Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield stood in a corridor. Not the corridor of the 3rd floor, not the corridor of a shared ward with thin curtains and cold fluorescent lights and the particular atmosphere of a place where suffering was processed efficiently but without tenderness. This corridor was new. It was warm. The lighting was amber and deliberate. The floors were clean and welcoming without being intimidating. And the chairs that lined the waiting area, were wide and cushioned and positioned with care, because the woman who had designed this space understood, in the most personal and specific way possible, what it felt like to sit in a chair that was beneath you during the worst hours of your life. The Margaret Ashworth Center for Maternal Care occupied the entire renovated ground floor of Meridian Grace Hospital. Eleanor had funded it from the foundation restructuring she had signed on the night of Margaret's birth. It was not the largest project the Ashworth Whitfield Foundation had ever undertaken, but it was the most personal. The center provided comprehensive maternal health care to women who would otherwise have no access to it. Women who would sit alone in corridors. Women whose partners would not come. Women who deserved, at the most vulnerable and powerful moment of their lives, to be in the right place, to have someone say to them, "Everything from here is taken care of." Eleanor stood in that corridor with Margaret in her arms, 6 months old now, with her mother's eyes and her great-grandmother's name and the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a child who did not yet know the story of how she arrived, but who would, one day, understand that the building she was standing in existed because of it. Gerald stood beside Eleanor, as he had stood beside 3 generations of Ashworth women, with the quiet, steady presence of a man who understood that his role was not to direct, but to support. To be the person who answered the phone on the second ring and said, "Give me 8 minutes." Tommy was there too, attempting to take a photograph of the dedication plaque on the wall, and somehow managing to include his own thumb in every shot. He had been promoted twice in 6 months. Gerald said it was because of his work during the hospital crisis. Tommy said it was because no one else was willing to run documents between floors at 2 in the morning. Both of these things were true. Dr. Anita Carver had come for the opening. She stood near the entrance, speaking with 2 younger doctors about the center's prenatal care protocols, and when she saw Eleanor, she crossed the corridor and placed her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm, the same gesture, the same warmth. Some things, it turned out, did not need to change. Nurse Rachel Daniels had transferred to the maternal care center. As its head of nursing, she had requested the position the day it was posted. She had told the interview panel, with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 12 years watching things happen in hospital wards, that she did not have the authority to fix, that she wanted to work somewhere that was built to do better. She got the job. Eleanor had not seen Dalton in 4 months. The divorce had been finalized quietly, without the extended legal warfare that the tabloids had predicted. Dalton had not contested. He had signed every document. He had agreed to every term. And on the day the final papers were filed, he had sent a single message to Eleanor through Gerald. It said, "I am sorry, not for getting caught, for not seeing you." Eleanor had read it. She had not responded, not because the words were meaningless, but because they were 4 years and 11 months too late, and the woman who might have needed to hear them no longer existed. Dalton had visitation rights. He used them. He came to see Margaret every other weekend, and he was, by all accounts, trying to be the kind of father he had never been as a husband. Eleanor did not interfere with this. She believed that Margaret deserved to know her father. She also believed that Margaret deserved to know what it looked like when a woman chose herself. And she intended to spend every day of her daughter's life demonstrating exactly that. Here is the last thing worth saying, dear viewers, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. The best revenge is not destruction. It is building a life so full of purpose and dignity that the people who tried to diminish you have to watch you thrive from the outside. That is the revenge they never recover from. Not because it is designed to hurt them, but because it is designed to free you. And freedom, real freedom, the kind that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone define the ceiling of what you are capable of, is something no one can take from you once you have claimed it. Eleanor looked around the corridor, at the women already being helped, at the chairs that were wide enough and soft enough and positioned with enough care that no one sitting in them would ever feel like an afterthought. At the name on the wall, Margaret Ashworth, the woman who had built everything and left it to someone worthy of carrying it. She held her daughter a little closer. She took a breath, and she walked through the doors of the building she owned into the life she had built, into the future her grandmother had seen for her, across a mahogany desk in thin afternoon light. She did not look back, not once, not ever, because there was nothing behind her that was more powerful than what lay ahead. Dear viewers, you just watched a woman who was overlooked, humiliated, and dismissed in her most vulnerable moment respond not with revenge, but with dignity, clarity, and the quiet, unstoppable power of a person who finally chose herself. The lesson here is simple but life-changing. Never mistake someone's silence for weakness. Never confuse their patience for ignorance. And never, ever treat a person's vulnerability as an opportunity to humiliate them. Because you do not know who they are. You do not know what they carry beneath their silence. And by the time you find out, it may be the most devastating discovery of your life. Drop in the comments the biggest lesson you learned from Eleanor's story. What would you have done differently if you were in her shoes? And subscribe for more powerful and unforgettable stories like this. Until next time, remember, know your worth, protect your peace, and never sit in a chair that is beneath you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful storytelling with real-life lessons. Every scene was crafted with intention, and every twist carries a message worth remembering. Thank you for being part of this community.